Hello learners, welcome to the third lecture in this NPTEL course on Victorian literature. As promised, we will continue our introduction to this literary field and we will change our tack a little bit. In the first two lectures, we have focused on the historical developments in the society and the culture of 19th century England, and we have discussed in great detail development in Victorian prose writing by focusing on the work of Thomas Carlyle and John Stuart Mill. Now, in the next two lectures, that is in this one and the subsequent lecture, we will describe the theoretical approach to Victorian literature, which is called postcolonial studies. And I will introduce the field and this theoretical approach by focusing on the work of Edward Said. Now, before we enter the scholarly discussion of the writer and this theoretical approach, I want to discuss a little bit about why this approach is important and why or how it can serve to illuminate this literary field for us in new ways. Studying Victorian literature today in the 21st century is impossible without engaging with the question of legacy. By legacy, I mean, what is it that these writers have left for us and how we can receive this gift or poison depending on how we judge this writing based on the historical developments that have occurred since these writings were produced. The word legacy can also be described by using a phrase which is the inheritance of loss. As some of you may know, this is the title of a very famous novel published in the year 2008 by the writer Kiran Desai and which also won the Man Booker Prize. This is a very telling turn of phrase and it describes very accurately the strange and very poignant combination of feelings that are invoked by the study and the reading of Victorian literature in 21st century India. Let's think a little bit about what this phrase contains and why I am calling it so powerful. The inheritance of loss is actually an oxymoron. That is, it contains two contradictory meanings in the same phrase. On one hand, we are talking about an inheritance. By inheritance, we refer to the coming into our possession of something. When we inherit something, we get something. Our possessions are increased. It is sort of a gift. When we inherit writing that was produced in the past, we receive it with an expectation of being enriched. So that is what the word inheritance refers to. On the other hand, the sense of optimism and gift is undercut severely by this last word in the phrase, which is loss. Loss very obviously means being dispossessed, to lose something. It is the act of losing something. So when Desai titles her novel The Inheritance of Loss, she is describing the experience of many people in post-colonial India and contemporary South Asia, not just India, but also the bordering nation of Nepal. The fate of Indians and South Asians in the 21st century is described as a struggle with this inheritance of loss. What have they inherited? They have inherited a history of dispossession which doesn't seem to get over. It seems to dog this group of people and it seems to create more dispossession, more struggle, more trauma in the present. That is what Kiran Desai's novel, The Inheritance of Loss, tries to describe. My point here is that the phrase, the inheritance of loss, also describes very accurately a range of feelings that are invoked when we approach Victorian literature. Why is that? That is because so much of what we see all around us today had its origins in the 19th century. That is to say, the time and the period and the cultural and economic context in which these works of literary art, which are today studied as Victorian literature, were produced out of the same combination of historical forces, which also produced much of the infrastructure, the culture, as well as the tradition that we see around us. What are some examples of these legacies? If we look at education, contemporary education in India today, the foundations of that were laid in Victorian England. If you look at the technology, much of the science that we study today, infrastructure like railways, these were all first developed in Victorian England, and more importantly, they were brought to India, they were implemented in India as part of the British government's occupation of India. Right? To use a more general term, modernity, the experience of living in a modern world with all of the comforts as well as the challenges and the pitfalls that modern life brings with it. All that experience of modernity itself had its origins in the 19th century. Now, getting into the specifics, there can be some debate about whether every technological or educational development of modernity had its origins strictly in the 19th century. There is some overlap between the 18th and the 20th centuries. But if we take into account a general view of what is known as the long 19th century, we can be certain that what we call today education, technology, and modernity had its origins in the 19th century. And so we have to accept that many of the problems that education, technology, and modernity bring with them have also been produced from the same combination of political and historical forces in which novels and poems, which are today studied as Victorian, also emerged. Now, if these are somewhat sanguine developments, there are other examples of things that originated in the 19th century and which are not so sanguine. The phenomenon of racism, inequality, social inequality, economic inequality, poverty, the discrimination between human beings based on gender, race, economic class, these things also had their origin in that same Victorian period. Now, if these two sets can be said to describe the good and the bad of Victorian legacies, we also have to account for another set of things which I will call the ugly. This is an ugly part of the Victorian legacy, and this includes historical events such as slavery, the creation of the modern phenomena of disability, as well as something which has mostly been eradicated from the world today, but one can still see it rear its head occasionally, which is eugenics. So slavery, disability, and eugenics form the ugliest part of this Victorian legacy, which we can say that has disappeared from our world, but many of the after effects, many of the lingering consequences and implications of these three things, that is slavery, disability, and eugenics, still persist in our society today. So, to return to the phrase, the inheritance of loss, when we study Victorian literature, we have to account for the relationships between the powerful literary texts that we study and these legacies which can be categorized into the good, the bad, and the ugly. What can scholarship, contemporary theoretical approaches, how can these approaches help us in negotiating this inheritance of loss, in reconciling the power and the beauty of the literary texts with these very complicated legacies? Now, one scholar and thinker who has done probably more than most others in helping us negotiate these complicated feelings is Edward Said. Edward Said was born in the year 1935 and passed away in the year 2003. He is most famous for a book titled Orientalism, which he published in the year 1978. Among his other works, and he's the author of numerous books, among his other works and most relevant to literary scholars and incredibly relevant and particularly relevant to any scholar of Victorian literature is the book Culture and Imperialism, which he published in the year 1993. We will discuss both of these books in greater detail, but before we do that, I want to provide a brief overview of his biographical background. Said was born in Palestine. His family left fleeing armed conflict, and as a result, the young Edward grew up in Lebanon, Egypt, and the USA. He went to colonial style British schools and had a very colonial education. Perhaps influenced by this kind of a British education, we don't know exactly how direct was this influence, but Edward Said studied for a PhD in English literature, and he wrote his doctoral thesis on Joseph Conrad's letters and autobiographical fiction. Now, this literary work inspired Edward Said to think deeply and widely about a phenomena that he titled Orientalism. These thoughts were published in the year 1978, and this book, Orientalism, has proved to be a tremendously influential work. It has been translated into 36 languages as of 2003, and that number may have increased, and indeed it keeps increasing. The argument that Said made in this book is extremely wide-ranging. It is a philosophical, historical, and cultural argument. It ranges from the history of Western thought and traces its implications in Said's contemporary times. So there are references to the armed conflict in the Middle East, as well as medieval and Middle Age writings on the Orient from Western Europe. So from the Middle Ages to the late 20th century, you can see that the argument has an extremely capacious historical range. It also has an extremely wide philosophical range and also a wide range of cultural and literary references. So what is Orientalism, and why exactly does Edward Said want us to think that it is important? Now, the shortest possible definition of Orientalism is that for Edward Said, Orientalism is a discourse. Now, Said borrows this word discourse from the work of the French philosopher Michel Foucault. Foucault defined discourse multiple times in multiple sources, in multiple books, and at different points in his career in different ways. Foucault's definition may be distilled into this, and these are my words. We can understand the word discourse as defined by Michel Foucault thus: it is a system of utterances, conventions, and linguistic practices by which societies define the boundaries of truth. Now, as you can see from that definition, it has to do with power. Who decides what the truth is? This is an essential part of Foucault's philosophy. Truth is not a universal given. It is not a universal reality, but rather truth is a function of power. It is not a function of ideology, but it is a function of power. Certain groups of individuals who happen to have the authority to decide things determine what can be called true and what cannot be called true. This is Foucault's definition of discourse. Now, how does Edward Said take this idea and apply it to formulate his argument about Orientalism? Now, according to Edward Said, there were many instances, cultural, linguistic, scholarly, many instances of such discourse in the 18th and 19th century literature of Western Europe, which sought to define the boundaries of the truth about the Orient. Right? So, for Edward Said, one can find much discourse about the Orient in 18th and 19th century writing from Western Europe. Right? These writings spanned a wide variety of genres and also applied to a wide variety of scholarly approaches. What were the features of this idea of this thing called the Orient? Now, it is important to note that for Said, this body of writing, this body of knowledge, which is creating a discourse about the Orient, is not to be confused with the Orient itself. Right? Now, the Orient is used in multiple ways. The word has multiple meanings. At the time that Said wrote his book Orientalism, there was a popular meaning of the word Orient. Now, it is not to be confused with the historical work that Said is doing in this book. One of the aims of this book is to question the popular notion, or the popular meaning of the word Orient, which was circulating at the time Said wrote the book. Said's point is that the meaning of the word Orient was created through this body of writing, which he is studying in this book. And now, let us think about what features of the Orient does Said identify in this body of writing. The first feature is that the idea of the Orient that these writings produced was a vague idea. It was vague because it had too wide a geographical range. Sometimes it covered Southwest Asia, sometimes it referred only to the Middle East, sometimes it referred only to Northern Africa. So it could either refer to all of these regions together, or it could refer to one of these regions alone. And both of these regions were identified as the Orient. So that was one way in which geographically the range was very vague. Further, it also sometimes focused specifically on particular nations and often confused particular nations with larger geographical regions. So, for instance, writers could be referring to Lebanon or Turkey or Iraq or Iran with little distinction about the national boundaries, as well as how much or how little the features of these particular nations aligned with the features of the larger Orient, or the larger Middle East, or the larger Northern Africa, or the larger Southwest Asia. So there was a lot of vagueness, and geographical vagueness was only one of the many ways in which this idea of the Orient, as defined by this body of writing, was vague. So the key feature of this idea of the Orient, as I've been discussing, is the geographical vagueness. Now, this was also often an inaccurate idea. Often it conflated the language, culture, and the landscapes to one concept, that is the Orient. It was also inaccurate because it substituted parts for the whole. That is, Southwest Asia and North Africa were often confused as standing in for the entire Orient. Specificity of morality, religion, and politics were also often erased and rolled into one concept, that of the Orient. Said's phrase for describing what kind of a concept, an idea this discourse created for the Orient was that it was a semi-mythical construct. One feature to note is that the common feature of all of this vagueness, all of this inaccuracy, was that it served to create a negative definition. That is, in the works of literature and scholarship and politics that Said studies, the Orient emerges as something that is defined negatively. That is, the Orient is defined not in terms of what it is, but what it is not. And Said's claim is that the Orient is simply everything that is not the Occident. And to better understand how this negative definition works, one can read about how Said identifies the features of these Orientals, that is, people who occupy these regions, how these Orientals are defined by these texts about the Orient. Now, who are these Orientals? They are defined by stereotypes. These are stereotypes of what the European is not or does not want to be, right? So the way the Oriental person is described in these works that Said studies, these people emerge as weak, barbaric, lazy, irrational, and effeminate. And these adjectives or these qualities are designed to throw stronger light against the opposites of these features, which are found in Occidentals, who, by contrast to the Orientals, appear to be strong, civilized, active, rational, and masculine. So there is a mutually exclusive binary opposition that the concept of the Orient and the discourse, more specifically speaking, of the Orient, which creates this binary opposition, in the works that Said studies. Now, further, Said moves on to describing versions or forms of Orientalism. The key distinction that Said makes is that between latent and manifest Orientalism. There is there's a manifest Orientalism which is found in policy documents and government decisions. There are overt articulations of these stereotypical notions of, say, the effeminacy or the barbarism or the irrationality or the weakness of Oriental people in many policy documents, in many government decisions. So there were actions taken by the governments of Western European nations in which these assumptions were treated as true. So there were people with political power who assumed the stereotype that was created in these cultural texts, and they literally assumed that people who lived in the Orient were less civilized, weak, effeminate, and so on. This Said calls an instance of manifest Orientalism, and this is a form of Orientalism which is easy to identify and therefore also easy to challenge and easy to call out. There is, however, another version of Orientalism which is less visible and therefore less easy to identify and challenge, and Said calls this latent Orientalism. This is an implicit form of Orientalism in which those stereotypical notions which cause a lot of violence to real people are not articulated explicitly. Rather, their effect is felt implicitly, right? So there are beliefs about people in Southwest Asia and North Africa, and these beliefs govern the writing of literature, writing of much fiction and non-fiction, even though the subject of such fiction may not be the definition of Orientalism itself. So this is a version of Orientalism which pervades not just texts that are explicitly about the Orient, but much general discourse in Western Europe, right? Now, the question of genre becomes important because we understand fiction as not engaged in ideological tasks. For Edward Said, if we take the concept of latent Orientalism, we can understand that the work of ideology is performed equally and sometimes much more perniciously by works of fiction. We will continue to understand this concept of Orientalism, and we'll see how it can illuminate the study and interpretation of literary texts in the next lecture. Thank you.